Hello and welcome to the 17th chapter of the course. In this chapter, we'll be going over another recent PSKO run of mine with a field size of around 300 people, 317. The buy-in is 530 and the starting stack is 25k. So the starting bounty would be $250 in total or $125 to be won once we knock someone out. Currently, the big blind is 600 and as I said, starting stack is 25k. We will start from here. The hands up to this point weren't very interesting. It was just a lot of folding or defending and missing flop and folding. So just saving you some time and starting from this one. We have 27 big blinds, which is around 15k. Let's see exactly. Yeah, so 16.5k out of 25k starting stack. So our bounty here is worth around 6.5k. So 25% of the starting stack, or 10.5-ish big blinds, around 11. Based on that, we don't really want to be having limps at this point. As we saw, limps start in once our bounty is very, very large, and here it's only 11 big blinds out of 27.5. So we go for an open, small blind jams, and we have a crystal clear call. Very happy call, and we win against deuces. Next up, pocket sixes. We are facing under the gun bin raise, and as we know in PSKOs, this is a spot where we mostly want to be calling. We don't really want to be doing much betting. We can instead call a very wide range. The reason we get to call wide is because on one hand, the opener is going to have a very wide opening range himself, since he covers most of the table. And on the other hand, we are also calling a lot of our semi-strong hands here, like pocket tens, like ace queen. So that in turn allows us to call more suited connected hands. Sixes is a very clear call. And we go post flop. King jack 9, monotone, and another gun checks. This is the kind of hand that could stab sometimes and could check sometimes. On these boards, our bluffs are all very low value hands, and we're basically trying to target the immediate auto folds. I roll passively, end up checking, and hit a 6 on the turn. So on the turn, our decision remains the same. We want to be checking sometimes, and we want to be betting sometimes. By betting, we can get value from a king, a jack. Our opponent can have a bunch of worse hands that kind of have to call against the smaller sizing. I roll passively again, or I'm just an it and I'm lying to you. And the river fills us up. Facing a small sizing bet, we have a mandatory raise. Question is, how large do we want to go here? And I think we want to have two sizings. One would be a more middling raise sizing to maybe around 6 big blinds, which would be some of our middle strength clubs, like maybe the 10 of clubs, for example, or the queen of clubs. And then a larger sizing, which would be our ace of clubs, a few times we check it back, and then our full houses. We have a house, so we go large, and our opponent folds. Next, we have queen 10 suited. We open. We're not going to be opening too wide here, but queen 10 suited, just not really close. And facing a 3-bet, calling is the standard play. 10-9-8, we check. We could have some leads here, but overall, I think that people on average tend to over c-bet a board like this. So I think going for a check raise instead is going to be of higher value. So we check and we face a fairly large c-bet, close to like 80% pot, something like this. So the question is, what do we do here? And the answer is that against what is probably going to be a somewhat polar c-bet range, we want to be playing fairly tight, but also aggressively. So we would be folding a hand like, say, ace 10, that cannot improve. Ace 9, of course, as well. But we want to continue aggressively with hands that have equity against the top range. So hands like jack 10 and queen 10 and jack 9 suited are hands that we just want to be jamming here, because we are doing okay against the calling range, and of course we need some protection with our pair. So queen 10, we go for the jam. And again, against aces, we are doing fine here. We have a decent-ish equity. We have the gut shot, back to flush draw, of course the pair outs, and our opponent ends up folding. Next we have jack 10, where we defend against an open. Our opponent checks back and we hit our straight. So here we want to be using larger sizing, especially in the PSKO. We definitely want to put the money in ourselves. When someone checks back this board, I don't think we will see many bluffs on the way. Usually it will be some middle strength showdown hand. I don't think our opponent, for example, is going to be checking back. I don't know. I can't even think of a hand like Queen 6 suited if he opens that and then just start bluffing. Yeah, there's just no bluffs here pretty much. And then River is a 9, so not the best card for our range, but we have a fairly clear jam. Opponent calls with queens. Yeah, I think I don't necessarily like this. Queens don't really block much of my value. It may be king-queen, but king-queen I think just jumps pre-flop and do block some bluffs. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of the call down. But hey, we got a bounty, so 6-5 suited. I opt to raise. As we saw in the blind versus blind situation, when we are covering at this stack size, we want to be raising a bunch. And these kind of suited connected hands are some of our go-to raising candidates. Opponent calls. And this is going to be a very high c-bet frequency board. We'd rather have a batch of Flusterer, but, well, can't have everything. Opponent calls, and once we completely brick and have no relevant blockers, no equity, nothing, we are just check folding. King 8. The reason we open this hand is that we cover everyone. This would not be an open in a normal non-PSKO tournament, but here covering we get to expand our opening range, so King 8 off does end up becoming an open. Small sizing range bet, opponent calls. And when our opponent has this short of a stack size, which is 16 big blinds, and his bounty, I assume it's the starting one, let's see. Yeah, starting bounty. So his bounty is worth around 10 big blinds. We want to be very, very wide for value here. So I would be value betting anything better than, I guess, Queen 10. King 8, definitely a hand that wants to bet call. So we bet, opponent jams, and we call, and win against King 5. I think King 5 should mostly check raise, get it in on the flop, given how large his bounty is in relation to his stack. But once he calls the flop, then turn jam looks really, really good. I think it's well played by our opponent. King deuce, just checking back against the small blind limp. On the flop, we call with a backdoor fluster for sure. Turn seems like a pretty standard check back. And then on the river, facing this kind of sizing, we're in a world of pain because this is overall a very underbluffed line. Going for half pot flop bet, then check turn, and then half pot on the river is just very, very value heavy. But we do have a very good bluff catcher, king, of course, really good. But then at the same time, the deuce unblocks almost all of our opponent's bluffs here. So we just have to call and see the bad news because it's always going to be a hand like ace rug or king queen. But yeah, such is life. Next up, we have ace 4 offsuit. And this is the first fairly interesting hand that we have. We face an open from the hijack for 10.5 big blinds, and the button ends up calling. So the button is covered by both the small and the big blind. And we're sitting on the big blind with ace 4 offsuit. Both the jammer and the button have started bounties, which at this point, they are worth around 8 big blinds, maybe 8.5, somewhere around there. So they're fairly significant. Now, my first thought here is that the button should be fairly tight here when he's covered by both the blinds and should have a bunch of jams. The all-in stack is 10 big blinds, so the bound is, as we said, like around 8.5. So definitely enough dead money in where the button gets to have a jamming range and not just call. However, I do think it can be easy for people to go a bit overboard here, especially because I think the small blind is very recreational, so potentially he doesn't find enough aggression or enough continues against the button call. And because I expect the button to potentially call a bit wider than he should, I elected to overcall with ace 4 offsuit. Now let's have a look at the solver. So hijack is jamming something like this. Is it hijack? Yeah, hijack. Perfect. Jamming something like this. And against that, maybe actually misclicked and run for cut-off jam instead of hijack because their stacks are super close. So let me do a quick pause and run this appropriately, and I'll get back to you in a second. Here we are with the real sim with hijack jamming this time. So he's supposed to jam like 25%. We can see force plus suited 9x basically can go fairly wide, but not every ace, and fairly tight on suited connected stuff. After the jam, the button is supposed to play like this. So indeed, we can see there's supposed to be a bunch of jamming with pocket pairs, offsuit ace-x, and suited broadways, and king-queen off. And then call a bunch with top range, as well as some like weaker ace-x, some suited ace-x, and so on. So basically, we want to jam our middle strength hands and call top range and then the weakest hands. Against this kind of response, when the button calls, the big blind actually has to play fairly tight. So ace-4 off, we can see, is supposed to be nowhere close, and we want to avoid high cards and stick more towards suited connected hands. Jam pocket pairs, broadways, and the better suited aces. However, I think in reality, the button will probably be a bit wider than that, as I said. So I wanted to node block this, and I gave him this kind of calling range. So basically, I expanded it from 11% all the way to 18%. And I added some more offsuit ace-x, I added offsuit broadways, some more suited hands. I think this is going to be closer to how I expect people to play. Against this kind of calling range, our response is this. So we call more, but also we just jam more aggressively. And we can see now this kind of ace-4 off, ace-5 off hands go into the jamming range. They are still going to be profitable calls. Ace-4 off, for example, these are very close. But yeah, we'd rather jam, but we don't fold against this kind of range. After we end up jamming, the button is supposed to call close to everything he called with, because the odds he's getting are just way too good with the dead money from the bounty. I think in reality, we'll probably see some more hands call and then fold, like ace-5 off, for example, ace-4 off. I think these hands he will call, but then just fold when I jam. So in hindsight, I think I would rather see myself jam this hand. But let's see what actually happened. So I called, and flop went check-check. On the turn, I went for a value bet. I think an ace can start value betting here. I don't expect my opponent to be checking back a lot of ace-x on the flop. He calls, and we river the straight. So now we jam, and we get called by ace-5 off. So I think that my assumption about him calling pre-flop wider and including these offsuit ace-x is correct. We can see in theory he's supposed to fold these hands and never call them. I could be wrong about him calling like ace-4 off. Maybe this is the worst hand he calls, but regardless, I think jamming this hand pre-flop is the way to go. Next, we have queen-jack. We raise and take it. Queen-9 suited, we raise, and we go three-way, which will be pretty much a range check flop for us, or very close to. Queen-9 of diamonds just doesn't want to put any money in. Turn, very similar. Then on the river, it's one of the hands that we want to be bluffing. We have to be a bit careful here. We can't be bluffing every single non-showdown hand that we have, or non-heart hand, because then we would end up massively over-bluffing. Because there isn't too big a difference between our bluffs here, having like high cards is worse than having lower cards, because we don't want to be blocking either like king, queen, king, jack hands that will be fairly standard lines like this, and then check fold on the river. Queen-9 is somewhere in the middle, not too high cards, not too low cards. So I think we just want to be mixing this hand between betting or checking. Thankfully it worked this time. And then we have 9-8. So what we have here is an auto lean stack. His bounty is around 2 standard bounties, which at this point, they would be worth around 16k, so 16 big blinds. Definitely a lot of blinds dead in the middle. We have a 3x open from under the gun. As we know at this point, this isn't really a thing. When the bounty is so large, he mostly wants to be jamming and then having some limps as well. We have a call and then another call, and our odds here in position covering everyone are just way too good. We cannot be folding here. We should be calling close to any 2 cards. 9-8, definitely strong enough to get in. I mean, the 3 blinds, not jam. The big blind jumps and three-way 9-8 off is just slightly too bad. I think anything suited connected, we would go here. 9-8 off, I think, looks like a fold. So we have 16 blinds in from the small blind. The big blind is another around 7, and the caller is another, let's see, 7. So it is about 30 big blinds dead in the middle. So we would need to call, how much is it, like 27 to win 92. And 9-8, I think, just falls slightly short. I end up folding, and Jack's ace is Jesus Christ. We would be so dead. Next, ace king. Facing an open from a fairly large stack, we know we want to have a bunch of calls here, especially when there is a very short stack behind with 8 big blinds. The scenario where this guy gets it in and then this guy ISOs or puts more money in is going to be amazing for us. And this beats the EV of 3-betting ace king. We go post-flop, king 6-8, and facing a large c-bet, we want to be calling. We don't want to have too many raises here. On the turn, we definitely want to start putting money in, so we go for this 70% kind of bet, and our opponent folds. Queen 8. As we saw in the limping chapter, when we face a limp, we definitely want to be over-limping a lot and not doing too much raising. I think this is a very good spot for that, because again, we have the very short stack that we want to maximize the range we get it in against him. So we limp, and he jumps, and the big blind re-jumps, and the limper re-jumps. So down we go. A6, raise and take it, new table as well. 6-4, facing a limp from the small blind, we can ISO or check. This hand is just supposed to mix. We roll passively, so we check, and against the large stab, we just have to fold. Next, we have A7 suited. Here, I think we can 3-bet or we can call, both options fine. I don't really mind either way. In Chippy V, we would rather 3-bet this hand, in a non-bounded tournament, but being covered, we are more incentivized to call. So I think just mixing is the way to go. Queen 7-3, check, check. Now, on the ace, we want to be doing a lot of checking here. The ace is much better for the baron than the small blind because he has all of the offsuit ace-X, whereas we do not. He also has all of the, of course, top range like ace-king, ace-queen that we always 3-bet. So we want to be doing a lot of checking here. And a7, I think, can mix between checks and bets. I rolled passively and checked. And we face a half-pot bet. Against this kind of sizing, we definitely want to raise. 2-pair will be very strong, and there are a lot of stuff to get value from. And we also have a lot of very natural bluffs with the double straight draw, double flush draw on the board. Opponent calls and river is a 10, which is sort of a break. We go for a 70% bet. Again, a lot of hands we can get called from. Worse ace-X, ace-3, potentially, the 2-pair. And our opponent ends up jamming. This is very sad. We are fairly high on our range. But what we need to think about here is, what does his value jam range look like? And I think for the most part, it will be king-jack, maybe queens that check back the flop. Tens, I don't think bet the turn, and if they bet, they probably bet fold. So his value range is queens and it's king-jack. So our actual hand strength doesn't really matter in terms of calling here. Like, we're not going to be up against queen 10 or ace 3 when he sizes like this, or ace 10 even. So what we want to be doing is trying to find a hand that blocks his value. So because of that, a hand like, for example, queen 7 suited that we will have pre-flop would be a better calling hand because we would be blocking pocket queens. And maybe ace jack would be better. A7 just doesn't have the necessary qualities to call here. Hand strength isn't as important as having the relevant blockers. So I go for the sad fold. Pocket threes, we call pre-flop, and we go 4-way on the flop, and we hit a set. Perfect. Facing a half-pot c-bet, I don't think we want to have almost any raises here. We are the first player to act, and it's a board that heavily favors the button and the big blind. So we end up calling, and button overcalls. Turn is the 9, and we face another large barrel. So here we could consider raising, but I think the problem comes that our hand is probably not strong enough. I think it's fair to expect him to fold over pairs on the turn, because we have every set, and then the button is uncapped here as well. So how can he bet call like queens here? I think that will be very optimistic to expect. And there is the straight out there, 7-8 suited. There are, of course, 9s, 6s, 5s. So I actually think 3s is not strong enough to jam here. I call, and river is a deuce, so now any 4 has a straight, and our opponent jumps. This is a very, very tough spot. Maybe it looks more of a clear call. But thing is, our opponent bets 3 times with large sizings 4-way. And there are 2 straights here, a 1-card straight with the 4, and then 7-8, and many, many possible sets. I think there aren't that many natural bluffs, maybe some king 7, ace 7 kind of hands. But then at the same time, I do think that against an unknown player, folding a hand as strong as 3s here could end up being very dicey. We would need to be very spot on with our read about his range. So I decided to call, and he had a very surprising hand. He had pocket 10s, which I'm not sure if it is a value bet or a bluff. It seems extremely thin to value bet here, but then it looks a bit too strong to be bluffing. So I'm really not sure what to make of this. But we take it. We accept. And this also, I guess, shows why it's too risky to be hero folding in spots like this with very high on range stuff. A7, raise and take it. King 10, we open, get 3-bet and fold. Jack 7, facing the 4x open, we want to be somewhat tight, but Jack 7 covering just doesn't get to fold. We know this is a spot he should be range limping. He doesn't. On the flop, our decision is fairly close. I think with the Jack of Spades, I would continue. With the 7 of Spades, I think probably fold, especially considering that his opening range will probably be very much on the stronger side pre-flop. Then we have Queen Jack suited. And facing an open from the bottom, I think we want to mix between 3-betting and calling here. I don't think we will get 4-bet jammed on that much. And at this point, the bounty is also not too relevant. He has 2 standing bounties, which is worth around 14 big blinds, maybe 13 big blinds. So yeah, it's not altering our decisions too much. I 3-bet, he calls, and we get a 7-8-5 kind of flop. Now, in PSKOs, we will be 3-betting less with suited connectors, so this board becomes worse for us than it would be in a normal non-PSKO tournament. So I do think we need to be checking sometimes, and mixing in some flush draws to our checking range seems good. So I decided to roll a low-frequency check, and we checked. Facing a stab, again, we want to be raising our flush draws sometimes and calling sometimes. I know that I said this before, maybe this isn't the most helpful thing to say, but it is just how these spots are supposed to play out. I rolled passively again and ended up calling. And on the turn, facing another bet. Here, again, I think we want to have some calls and some jams. We want to be jamming some of our flush draws because, again, we want to have value jams, and these are the best bluffs we can have. We'd rather jam Queen Jack of clubs than say 9-10 of spades. So I ended up jamming and got the fold. I think it's a fairly complicated hand, but I think mixing in this line with flush draws and a hand like this is the way to go. Pocket 8s, we open and we get 3-bet from the cutoff. And then the big blind jumps. This is a fairly interesting spot for us. So the big blind has 2 standing bounties and the cutoff has 1.5. Their bounties aren't worth much, but still the big blind jumps 30 big blinds and his bounty is worth like 11 or 12. So it is quite a significant amount. However, the cutoff being covered shouldn't be 3-betting much here. So yeah, I think it's a very awkward spot. In hindsight, I think I'd rather get it in with pocket eights and maybe fold like sixes. I ended up folding in game, and yeah, I think this is not the correct decision. Pocket fours, we open, and button calls, big blind calls. This is a flop we want to be betting a very high frequency. King high boards are really good for the opener because we have all of the offsuit combinations. Button calls. On the king pair, sometimes we want to keep on barreling, but we also want to add some of these kind of hands into our checking range. So I roll the check. And facing a half pot bet, I think our hand should mostly continue by raising. We unblock all of the king X, so it's important for us to try to stack them off. I go for raise and opponent folds. King 9 suited, we open, big blind defense. This is not going to be a range bet flop for us, and second pair backdoor flush draw is one of the most common check back hands, so I go ahead and check back. On the turn, we face a half potish, like 40% probe, and we don't really have a decision here, definitely calling. On the river 5, we face another like 40% bet. And I'm not too excited here, but 9 with a live kicker is a bit too strong of a hand to fold. I end up calling, and we're up against 8-9. I think our opponent put a bit too much money. I think turn is fine, but then on the river, I would think he wants to go a bit smaller. Jack 5 falls to us, and we go for a limp. We don't really want to have raises here, like 200 blinds deep or 170. Opponent checks back, and this is a board where we want to be betting around 50% of the time. Jack 5 backdoor flush draw seems like a very reasonable betting hand. And we face a small raise. Getting such amazing odds, we get to continue very wide here, and a hand with the backdoor straight flush draw just doesn't really get to fold yet. On the 10 though, everything bricked, so now we are gone. Next we have nines. We raise from the hijack, and big blind 3 bets off 127 big blinds. No decision for us, we always call. Flop small c-bet, again, no real decision. On the turn, we could bet or we could check. Our hand wants to be mixing. Betting makes sense because we can get value from worse pairs, like some 7x, 6x he will have. Also deny equity from a hand like, say, Jack 10 suited. But then, again, by betting, we end up value cutting sometimes, and also very vulnerable to check raises. And also, we end up with a too weak of a check back range. I rolled passively and checked. And then on the 4 river, our opponent goes for a fairly large bet. And I remember this hand, I was fairly curious here, because this kind of sizing is mainly going to be, I guess, 2 pair or better. It's hard for him to have 2 pairs, so it has to be a straight. But then, what kind of 5x doesn't bet the turn? Ace 5 always does. King 5 suited, if he has that, always does. 7-5 suited doesn't 3-bet pre-flop. 4-5 suited doesn't check the turn. So then 6-5 suited is the only hand our opponent can have for value here then. Maybe pocket queens, but no, that's too big for pocket queens. It's just going to end up value cutting too often. So I ended up folding, but I think against the range that will be 6-5 suited or air, we should actually just end up calling here with pretty much everything. Until we are proven wrong and he ends up having, like, I don't know, pocket jacks or something for the sizing. But I do think when he bets so large on the 1-card straight, it will be 2 pair plus. There are almost no 2 pairs for his 3-bet range here, so it's straight or better. And 6-5 suited is the only straight he can possibly have here. So yeah, I think in hindsight, I would just rather call. 7-8, we open, big blind defense, and range bet small and fold. King, queen suited, we open, big blind jumps for 15. No real decision for us. We call and lose to ace 8. I think standard jump from him. Pocket tens, we open and we go 3-way with the cutoff and the big blind, both being fairly short. On the flop, I think we can bet or we can check. Both options are fine. I roll passively. And on the turn, we have a fairly clear value / protection bet. Cutoff calls, and the river is the jack of diamonds. So we check and we face this kind of 70% bet. And our decision here is fairly close. So thing is, our hand doesn't really block potential bluffs, but then our opponent doesn't have many natural bluffs to begin with. His bluffs would have to be ace-5 suited, that's it. He doesn't call 6-7 suited preflop. I just can't really find many bluff for him, and he'd have a bunch of diamonds, some king x that checks back, potentially ace-3 suited, depending on how he plays his range preflop. So I just think it's going to be a very under-bluff spot with this kind of stack size where he doesn't have 5-6 suited or 6-7 suited. So because of that, I ended up folding. But yeah, I could be massively overfolding here, but I think it's going to be good. Ace-4 suited, we open and we go three-way. This is a fun hand. So I end up c-betting. As we said, king-high boards are really good for the opener. So ace-4 suited needs protection, can fold out better hands on future streets. Looks like a good c-bet hand. We get called by low jack, and the big blind raises to a small sizing. When we are so deep, we can't really be folding a hand like this. We have the two pair outs, we have the backdoor flush draw, we beat bluffs, so we end up calling, and turn is the 10, and our opponent checks. So what I'm thinking of here is that my hand actually makes a lot of sense to start bluffing. We block a lot of our opponent's bag range. We block like 8-4 suited, king-4 suited. Well, king-4 suited we do not because of the suits, but 8-4 suited we block pocket fours, which is full frequency in his range. And also, we are fairly low on our range here. So I decided to start bluffing because we also need a bunch of protection. If our opponent has like 6-7, folding that is really good. And we get called, and the river is the jack of hearts. So at this point, we pretty much don't really have many worse hands. We would have maybe 6-7 suited, and that's it. But I think ace-4 is a better bluffing hand than 6-7 suited. 6-7 might also just end up checking back on the turn because we have the double gutter, and we really don't want to risk getting check jammed on the turn. So ace-4 is one of the worst hands we have, and also has okay bluffing properties. Yes, we'd rather have a heart, but it's really hard for us to actually find a heart in this line. So I end up jamming, and we get the fold. 7-8, we defend and check fold. 9-7 suited. Opening very wide here, 9-7 definitely makes it. And I go for a small c-bet sizing. I don't really like this. I think against this short stack on the big line, we should just be going for half pot range. And that's because he just doesn't defend much ace-x. His ace-x will just get it in preflop most of the time. I think we shouldn't have any small sizings here. Next we have ace-4 suited. We defend four-way. And on the flop, just folding here. Our hand cannot improve. Ace-king, we raise and take it. 5-3, yep, checking. And on the turn, I decide to lead. I think this is more of an exploit against the weaker player on the bottom, who I think will be over c-betting the flop. Otherwise, the big blind shouldn't really be having many leads here. Opponent calls and I end up checking the river, and I don't like this. I think I should bluff the river because we just unblock all of the one heart combinations. I think this check is not good. This is another fun hand. So we have an under the gun jam, and he has 4 starting bounties. So that would be around 30K, 32K, which is like 14 big blinds, somewhere around that, like 13 big blinds. So almost as much as he jams. Under the gun 1 clicks it, and under the gun 2 calls. So we already know this isn't a thing. We've seen a bunch of sims with a short stack going all in, and we know we want to either be calling or jamming. This clickback just doesn't accomplish anything because we're not denying enough equity from the guys behind. The odds that for example, under the gun, +2 is getting, are still really, really good. And we'll end up calling this kind of clickback very, very often. Pocket tens in this spot is definitely strong enough to jam. Yes, sometimes we'll end up crashing into better, but there's just way too much dead money. I go for the jam, and we get a heads up against, sadly, ace-jack. Thankfully, because of the clickback, though, we end up making back what we lost. 8-6, we check again. So facing this half-pot bet multi-way, I think we should be calling at this stack size. The SPR is just a bit too large to start raising this kind of hand. And then also, when we're up against a recreational, we shouldn't be too concerned about trying to play the theoretically correct approach, which would be mainly check raising on this flop. So I call, turn, half pot, yeah, we call again, and then river, we win against ace-3. 9-5 suited, we overlimp, and on the flop, check, check, river, check, check, and on the river against the pot sizing, just have to fold. Queen-jack suited. I end up calling here. I don't think squeezing is going to be good, because on one hand, we're not that happy to get in against the opener, should be pretty tight. And then we also have the covering stack calling on the bottom. On top of that, there should be some ICM pressure as well. There is about a third of the field left at the moment with like 15% paid. So not much, but not zero. I end up calling, and facing the large flop bet, we just fold. Ace-jack, we face an open and a call. Again, this is the kind of hand that we want to be overcalling here. We don't really want to be squeezing with a hand that is as middle strength as ace-jack. And playing with the recreational also has the added bonus. C-bet and a call, and as we know in the multi-way spots, the player facing a bet and a call wants to play a very tight, very raise-heavy strategy. So I think ace-jack gets to value raise here. Something like ace-9, I would be more inclined to call, but ace-jack, I think, just gets to raise for value. So I raise and get called by the opener. Turn is the 7, and at this point, our hand is just not strong enough to keep on barreling. Our main point of check raising is that we get value by worse ace-6 and deny some equity from some suited backdoor flush draw kind of hands. We definitely want to have some check give-ups with our bluffs on the turn, and also some check calls with our middling hands like this, at least against smaller sizings. So I check, and we face a half pot sizing. So now, I think this is a fairly difficult spot, because our hand is kind of the bottom of our flop check raise value range. We don't check raise any hand other than ace-jack that check folds, but checks the turn. Yeah, I mean, ace-9, as said, would call the flop, and 2-pair is obviously stronger than ace-jack. So ace-jack is actually the bottom of the strong hands we raise the flop with. The jack of clubs also appears to be a very bad kicker, because we block hands like queen-jack of clubs and king-jack of clubs, which would be hands that our opponent would be calling the flop with, and then turning into a bluff on the turn. So because of that, I think we should now just end up check folding. I get that this hand feels fairly weird, because, yeah, we raise the flop and then check fold the turn, but I think this is the correct approach for this hand. Jack 10, we open, big blind defense of 27, 28. His bounty, as we said, is for starting, which is around 32k, which is around 9 big blinds. So we range bet small, he raises. I think Jack 10 mostly wants to call, Queen Jack, I would just get it in. So we call, turn 4, face another bet. And now Jack 10, I think, should be jamming. It is one of the strongest jacks we get on the turn with, so we want to value jam and deny equity from a bunch of his draws. We end up jamming, and we take it down. Queen Jack facing a squeeze, just gonna be a fold. 5-7, we defend and check fold. Pocket queens, we open, big blind defense. And this is a board that we want to be having middle sizing c-bets. We don't want to be range betting. So when we bet, we want to go for this half pot sizing. Opponent calls, and on the turn, I go for this 1/3 bet. I think we could be checking here, But also betting seems fine. With the heart, I don't mind checking either. I just would be mixing on the turn. Ace Jack, we open, and we face a very small 3-bet from the recreational on the big blind. So on one hand, this is very scary because he has been very call happy so far. And it also sucks because we're kind of close to the money bubble, so some more premium. But on the other hand, it's a super small sizing, we're in position, and we have a fairly decent hand. So I decided to call. Flop very good. On the flop, I think betting or checking, both fine options. I roll passively. Turn, he goes half pot, we call. River, he goes for 40%, and we just call again. I think it's a bit too thin to raise for value. And we're up against jacks. Yeah, I think the 3-bet preflop is way too small for him, and also I think it's a bit of an overplay to bet twice. Then we have Queen Jack suited. Facing a raise and a call, we want to be calling. Again, the hand isn't a hand that we want to 3-bet get it in, and we're also covered by one of the callers. Flop 10-4 with our flush draw. Facing the stop, as we know, the first player to act wants to be playing a very call-heavy strategy in multi-way, so we call. And out of the gun raises. And the stabber folds. We're in a pretty tough spot, but I think we have to continue at the odds we're getting. We shouldn't be up against the house almost ever, because pocket fours is just open fold preflop. So getting these good odds, I just think we have to continue. So I end up calling. I don't think we want to jump this hand. We just end up getting it in with a bit too low equity, I think. Turn goes check, check, and river is a 9. So here I decide to go for a jam. I think we are very close to the bottom of our range. So jamming this makes sense. A lot of our lower flush draws will have a pair. Our better flush draws, well, they're better hands, but also just get it in on the flop sometimes. So yeah, I think we have to jam this and hope our opponent folds. And he does. King Queen facing the limp from the recreational. We go for an ISO. In hindsight, I think I would rather size up a little bit. Go maybe 5.5, 6 big blinds. He calls. On the flop, I go for a half pot c-bet. I don't think we want to be betting too small on this kind of board against the limp calling range. And we get click back. King Queen without a club, I think just folds. With the back to flush draw, I would continue. 10-4 off. On the turn, against this kind of sizing, I think our decision is fairly close. But having a 10, I think, is very bad. We block the natural bluffs in the Jack 10, Queen 10 kind of hands. So I decided to fold. Pocket Kings. We face a 10 big blind jam, and here we mostly want to be calling. The bounty, I think, isn't too significant. He has, 2-ish starting bounties, which would be worth around 18k, so like 3.5 big blinds. So yeah, definitely not a spot we want to be having jams on for 64. So we call, and we're up against ace 4, and that is a dramatic run out. And yeah, so we are actually in the money here. It's 13-9 players left. We didn't have too much of a bubble play. I guess it just broke too quickly, or we were completely card dead. Ace 8, we open big blind defense, and this is the kind of hand that we want to bet on the larger side. We will have some checkbacks here, but ace 8 just benefits too much from betting. Ace 9, we open, and the small blind, the recreational calls. Flop, I opt to check back. I think our hand could go either way. I would rather check more with like ace jack. Ace 9, I think either way is fine. Our opponent was overall a bit too check raise happy, which I think pushed me more towards checking back. On the turn, he bets half pot, and I think our hand is a bit too strong to fold. On the river, he goes for this kind of 10 big blind sizing. And here, I think the 9 kicker is actually pretty good. We block 9-7 and 10-9, which would be some of the main value bets he's going to have, which have a draw on the turn and then improve on the river. So I think this kind of hand makes more sense to call with than, say, ace-queen. Because they should be the same in hand strength, both bit bluffs, but the 9 seems like a more relevant kicker than the queen. So I decide to call, and we're up against ace-5. So I guess, yeah, our opponent is over-bluffing by quite a decent margin. Queen-jack suited, we open, and yeah, just folding against the jam. Queen-10. I go for a limp. In hindsight, I think I would just rather raise this hand. This kind of middling card offsuit hands benefit a lot from raising. And flop, yeah, we just check. Against the bet, I think I should just fold in hindsight. We can make an argument for calling if we think he splits his sizing and mostly goes big with his better hands. But I think without a club, I would rather just fold the flop. Queen-jack suited, we call against the recreational. And on the flop, our decision is pretty close, but I still think we get to call. We have the backdoor straight flush draw and 2 overcards. And the bricky 6 turn, he checks, but the 6 improves the big blind quite a bit. I think our hand can bet or check on the turn. I think either option is fine. We can't bet all of our missed backdoor flush draws here. So I just decided to mix and roll the check. And on the river, yeah, just have to fold. King-9 suited. Again, we want to be calling here. We won't be playing too many 3-bets, and our opponent is a weaker player. On the flop, so the half-pot c-bet sizing is a bit scary, but I think our hand is a bit too strong to fold with the overcard and backdoor straight, backdoor flush draw. We do get the backdoor flush draw, and again, I think our hand can mix between betting or checking. Either option is fine, so we bet. And we get clicked back. This is very, very unfortunate, but I think getting these amazing odds, we kind of have to call and hope we improve. We do not. I think the flop is very close. Maybe I could see myself folding, especially with some ICM being around 30 players left. But yeah, I don't really mind it. Aces, sadly no action. King-jack suited. Sadly, too much action, but our hand is a bit too strong to fold, especially with the weaker player in. But yeah, on the flop, not much to do. Jack-7 suited, I think over-limping here makes a lot of sense. We want to maximize the hands we get to play against the recreational from an explorative point of view. From a theoretical point of view, we want to be over-limping a lot and not really be isolating much when we are the covered stack. Our bounty is also fairly significant. We have 4 starting bounties, which is worth around like 5.5 big blinds. We go 4-way, and I think against the half pot bet, I should probably continue here. I ended up folding, but yeah, I think I should just call. Pocket tens, we open, we go 3-way. So it's not a board that I want to be betting a very high frequency, but these kind of 9s, 10s, ace-8 suited hands do benefit a lot from betting. So we bet for this larger side with these larger size with this specific kind of hands. Then we have pocket 9s. We face a 12 big blind jam from the cutoff. And what I want to look at here is whether we want to be calling or jamming. Our hand obviously continues. Cutoff is maestro, right? Yeah, he's maestro. So his bounty is 4 starting, same as ours. So around 5.5 big blinds, which is quite a bit compared to his stack size. I ended up calling in game and winning against King Jack. But let's see what the solver says. So cutoff jams. And yeah, so the solver suggests that we end up jamming almost all of our pocket pairs, along with offsuit ace-x and suited broadways. However, I think there is some interesting mechanic in play here where if we jam, the big blind is supposed to call pocket 5s and 6s and a bunch of these hands. Now, I would think that something like pocket 5s is more likely to fold here. We are fairly deep, we're at 27 players left. So what I think is that these low pocket pairs will fold if I jam, but will jam if I call. So the EV of 9s between calling and jamming is almost identical. As you can see, there's basically no difference. So I do think the fact that if we jam, he calls 5s and 6 in theory, but I expect him to fold. Whereas if I end up calling, then I think he will jam these pocket pairs always. My assumption could be wrong, but when the downside of calling is so small, I think I want to go with my assumption.